Hello and welcome to Never Mind the Bar Charts with myself, Mark Pack. This time I'll be speaking with one of the authors of a new research paper titled Breaching the Blue Wall, Could Tactical Voting Help England's Progressive Parties Defeat the Conservatives? That's Alan Wager, who wrote it along with Aaron Chung and a previous popular podcast guest, Tim Bale. So welcome to the show, Alan.
Hi, Mark. Good to be here.
I think Tim has been two of my three most popular podcast episodes ever. I think, if I remember rightly, have featured your co-author, Tim. So no pressure, Alan, no pressure.
I know it's a popular podcast for political scientists. My friend Paula Surridge has been on it a few times as well.
Absolutely. Let's start with, if I may, actually with the word progressive in the title of your research paper, because I suspect the blood pressure of a few listeners will have already risen on use of that. And I know, in fairness, you put the word progressive in quote marks in the title of the paper. But what is it that you mean when you're talking about whether tactical voting could help England's progressive parties? Who is it that you've got in mind?
Yeah, well, when we're talking about the interaction between political parties, as we're sort of political scientists, we're partly thinking about things like who would form the next government. And I mean, it seems increasingly clear that the Conservative Party have sort of run out of coalition partners, if you like. And that means that it does make sense to think about the other political parties as not one party, not one sort of unit, but as a sort of potential block, as a different alternative government. And then you can use all sorts of words for that. I mean, progressive is one extremely problematic potentially way of describing it, but also, on things like opposition to the government on things like corruption, there is what seems to be an increasing synergy in some aspects of the party. So that means that you sort of thinking about how voters perceive the interaction between these parties is also sort of really, really important too. And that leads to words that, as always, for over a century, led to words like progressive to describe voters that are likely to be hospitable to voting for any party that's not the Conservatives. So I suppose the other way of putting it would be to what extent would anti-conservative tactical voting be instead of progressive, if you like.
And I guess, just digressing for a moment before we even really get into your paper, but that sense of the Conservatives having run out of coalition partners, I think, is sort of almost underappreciated at the moment. That we quite often talk in British politics, partly influenced by US politics, about factors which maybe benefit the Conservatives around things like how the boundaries are drawn, vote distribution, and so on. But I think there is now this factor which is very different from 2010, but also different from 2017. The last two elections we've had that have turned up hung parliaments, that it's really hard to see, unless something dramatic happens in Northern Ireland that patches things up with the DUP, it's really hard to see who the Conservatives' partners would be in a hung parliament. And in that sense, the winning post for non-Conservative parties is that much lower, because Labour, in the 2010 environment, Labour not having more MPs than the Tories was a significant impediment to them staying in power. After the next election, that's much less of a factor, most likely, isn't it?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the big advantages for the Conservatives in the last election, the sort of structural advantages, if you like, is that they were able to unite the Leave vote, or whatever, if you like, the right-wing vote under one umbrella, under one party, whereas other votes were more on the issue of Brexit, particularly, were spread evenly across political parties. That's a big advantage for the Conservative, but it has a flip side, which means that if in any hung parliament situation, they don't have any other parties to cooperate with, and that means that the calculations about how Boris Johnson or his successor or anyone else might be able to stay in numbers after the next election are more complicated than they were way less complicated than they were for David Cameron or even for Theresa May. And I think you're right. That's an underappreciated aspect of British politics and of the current sort of state of the parties, if you like.
Yeah, and obviously all of this becomes moot if the Conservatives have a majority after the next election. So let's turn to what your paper sort of looks at, and particularly the potential role of tactical voting. Maybe we should just start with just a quick summary of what your paper's main findings are.
Yeah, so the main findings of the paper is that there is a significant potential for the Liberal Democrats to benefit from tactical voting in a range of seats in England, and that the Liberal Democrats disproportionately are likely to benefit from the electoral geography of the UK, which means there's a lot of places where the Liberal Democrats are in second place and where there is a potential squeeze message possible on Labour voters, and where
unleash the bar charts. Excellent.
and where they are increasingly, and when there's an increasingly clear delineation of responsibility, if you like, between the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats, if you're looking to attract sort of tactical votes. And that's a key element of this, is that potentially the electoral geography, which was really actually pretty difficult after the 2017 election for the Liberal Democrats and for those parties that were trying to unite the Remain vote, that is a lot less difficult now, and it's a lot clearer for voters. The signalling is a lot clearer for voters, and that's a really important thing for when thinking about how that might play out in any contest.
And certainly my impression, I think, both from looking at the results of 2019, but also research such as yours, is that, as you say, that tactical vote choice in different constituencies, by and large, is going to be a lot clearer at the next election than it was at the last one. That there are definitely will be some seats where, say both Labour and Lib Dems argue, we're the best place to beat the Tories here. But the number of those seems to be much smaller. And I think that matters not just for the decisions people in Party HQ make, but also for the enthusiasm of volunteers and where they choose to go. So I think if you saw in 2019, at least from a Lib Dem perspective, one thing you particularly saw was Labour activists fired up to go and campaign in seats where they basically ended up helping the Tories get re-elected because they thought they could. And in fairness to some of the people in Labour HQ, I think quite often that was a phenomena that was as much driven by grassroots enthusiasm as any, attempted central direction. So I think on both fronts, it feels like, and maybe this is just me wishing the truth to be but it does feel like it's a much more promising territory for effective anti-Tory tactical campaigning and tactical voting next time round.
Yeah, I mean, the constituencies that were most, that featured most heavily in coverage of tactical voting were actually exceptions to the rule. Places like City of London and Westminster, and places like Kensington are really quite different to the vast majority of seats where there is a sort of progressive majority of voters. I mean, that's the sort of the really striking thing, is that we produced this sort of graph where there's basically very, very few voters, very, very few places where there is a latent sort of majority for parties that are anti-conservative, if you like. And also that where there is competition where there's clear competition between Labour and the Liberal Democrats. And again, going back to 2010 and 2005, 2001, that really wasn't the case. I mean, I think it's easy to forget that the interaction between these opposition parties now is really very different to what it was a decade ago.
So in a way, that sounds a relatively promising picture for the Lib Dems. And although I note you're wearing a Lib Dem coloured top today, very appropriate for this recording, obviously one of the advantages of people in political parties listening to outside experts like yourself is that you can help throw cold water on over-enthusiastic interpretations. So what's the less good bit? What are the less promising bits of this picture that people in the Lib Dems, or indeed other non-Conservative parties, should bear in mind, so we just don't get swept away with this idea, hooray, the Tories are going to lose?
Well, one of the aspects of it that's more difficult at the Liberal Democrats is that when comparing to the Red Wall, the movement of voters over time away from Labour towards the Conservatives, for example, was happening before Brexit. It was happening in 2005, 2010, 2015. I mean, and for the Liberal Democrats, some of the movements towards them in these places, in the blue wall, if you like, were more sudden, and then potentially were more contingent on Brexit. We don't know for sure. I think the evidence we have so far from this Parliament suggests that they weren't contingent on Brexit still being, live whether or not Brexit happens, because we've seen further sort of geographical realignment along these lines. But it's possible that Brexit is the decline in salience, if you like, of Brexit could mean that these places are less likely to continue to move towards Liberal Democrats.
Yeah, I like the blue wall phrase because it encapsulates a whole load of things in just 2 words and in a way that, for example, the media can relate to. But it is, as you say, I think the blue wall is very different from the red wall. That the key insight, when James Kanagoshian originally came up with the concept, was that here is a group of seats which, if you look at them on every criteria other than votes in the ballot box, should be fairly favourable territory for the Conservatives and a shifting the Conservative direction. And yet that hadn't translated really into election results, election outcomes at least, and therefore that there was a brittleness to that apparent Labour lock on lots of areas. I think the blue wall story, as you say, isn't one about, these are loads of places that in a sense should have been Lib Dems 20 years ago, and it's just, that there's a cultural thing that's holding them back. I think the blue wall is much more this is just area that is good potential for a party like mine to grow. But I guess the flip side of that is that, in a way, because the red wall and the blue wall challenges from a Conservative perspective are therefore so different, they're 2 quite different political battlegrounds. If you can pull off winning in both, as the Tories did in 2019, brilliant from their perspective, you get a huge majority. But that's a really hard trick to pull off, to win 2 such different political battles at the same time, isn't it? And so there's a real brittleness to that, the size of that Tory majority, I think.
Yeah, and actually, I think the James Kanagoshian's insight that the red wall was sort of culturally apart from other areas that have voted Conservative was really important. But that's not to say that actually we're not seeing quite a sudden cultural movement in these blue wall places that is alike to that. So you've got a situation where actually in quite quickly, particularly, for example, as we see, and I saw there was a blog on the LSE review blog yesterday talking about the demographic drift out of London. I mean, things like this are going to be long-term structural factors that will increasingly mean that there potentially is quite an anomaly in the way that these places are Conservative, despite their demographic characteristics. So we could,
and I noticed that in Chesham and Amersham, that although the ethnic minority community in that constituency is relatively small, and hence it wasn't a big part of the political story, nonetheless, you could see that there has been that growth of particularly an Asian community in that constituency that essentially is migrating northwest out of London. If you look at the long-term demographic trends, there is a move up northwest, as it were, through Chesham and Amersham, and it looks like, I guess, those trends will continue further up as well. And that's, but those sorts of trends are quite slow moving in many ways.
Yeah,
culture can nonetheless change very quickly. I'm very struck how same-sex marriage, which is obviously the touchstone issue Lib Dems like talking about, but the switch in public opinion from it being a sort of controversial fringe issue 20 years ago to it, having overwhelming majority support now, is, it's not just about generation shifting. Actually, people themselves do sometimes change their views on cultural issues. And I guess what is a complete unknown at the moment is post Brexit referendum, quite how quickly or slowly those long-term trends will play out.
No, absolutely, yeah. And another thing to think about when thinking about all this blue wall stuff in the context of, for example, what we're about to see is sort of potentially a string of by-elections, some of which you would say are in the blue wall potentially. If you're thinking about a potential by-election in Windsor, some of which certainly wouldn't fall into any fair categorization of blue wall, but are already being discussed as blue wall places, is whether or not a sort of really wide definition of blue wall that isn't very useful for political scientists or analysts could still be politically useful for the Liberal Democrats, or potentially a problem for the Liberal Democrats. If places like Old Bexley and Sidcup are characterised as blue wall, does that increase the expectations beyond anything that's realistic given their demographics? or does it a political narrative and a media narrative around these places that is potentially favourable to the Liberal Democrats and makes it easier to sort of create a political competition in these places? I think that's a really interesting question. I don't know whether you.
It's not giving away any secrets to point out that Ed Davies' first by-election campaign visit of this current clutch of by-elections was to North Shropshire. And I think that will be a particularly interesting test, that by-election, because North Shropshire in many ways is not really blue wall territory, but in other ways actually is blue wall territory. You can argue it either way. Fundamentally, it is the sort of traditionally Tory area that, if you look at things like the council election results this May, that is very vulnerable to a Lib Dem challenge. I think it was there were 6 marginal council wards that the Tories just beat the Lib Dems in this set of May elections in the constituency. So it's, in that sense, that Tory grip is very brittle. This by-election will give a good test of whether, a very narrow purist blue wall definition that leans very heavily on geography and Remain vote is the right one to think about, or actually if there is a broader picture to think about. And obviously, I'm hoping that it will be the broader picture, but I think for people like yourselves, the result will be quite significant as well, therefore.
Yeah, I mean, and the Liberal Democrats have obviously a non-conformist, rural tradition in part, and that was obviously in the southwest, a lot of that tradition. But obviously, Brexit interlinks a lot of these things like rural issues that are, that are causing a real headache in real problems in places like North Shore. I mean, for example, things like the slaughter of pigs. I mean, that has left the news agenda, but it's still actually a reality. The policy problem hasn't actually been solved. Stuff like the sewage issues. That these are all problems that are Brexit related, disproportionately rural issues, and where you could see some movement back towards the Liberal Democrats being able to pick up voters who are annoyed about the direction of the government and the sort of status quo, if you like. Not to say none of the above party, but that was sort of, that's a potentially important string in the bow of the Liberal Democrats that would be useful to sort of regain, if you like, after the coalition years.
And I guess that's where all of the Owen Pattinson and related sort of scandals, I think, is so dangerous for the Conservatives, because what has really propped up their support so far in this Parliament is the widespread view amongst voters, which I very much disagree with, but one has to acknowledge is there amongst lots of voters, that Boris Johnson is has been sort of trying his best to deal with coronavirus. The Times Red Box focus groups, this comes through really clearly. The number of people who, frustratingly and wrongly from my perspective, in a way give Boris Johnson they say, well, look, all countries around the world are struggling. Let's give him a reasonable wide berth of support, because it's not easy struggling with a worldwide epidemic. But the Owen Pattinson and then some of the other stories that have come to light since as well, that all paints a very different picture. That's not that risks painting the picture of, okay, these aren't people struggling to do their best in difficult circumstances. That then becomes, these are people who don't care about me, don't care about, and are in it for themselves. And that, I think, is really potent when voters no longer think politicians are struggling on their behalf.
Yeah. I mean, what one of the elements of our paper that, and it speaks to something you were talking about earlier, is places where it's clearer that voting for the Liberal Democrats is the best anti-Conservative vote and are within a significant but not impossible swing from Conservative to the Liberal Democrats, actually opens up those two ingredients opens up a sort of another over a dozen constituencies that are really ones to look out for if the Conservative Party are going to be in trouble at the next election. And those are places that actually might be quite surprising to some people. Places like Witney, the former constituency of David Cameron, and Henley, where Boris Johnson represented. These are places that would be big stretch targets for the Liberal Democrats, but would certainly, if you're looking at particularly voters that are high interest voters, for example, particularly voters that maybe are graduates and so on in these constituencies, there really is the ingredients for for some political surprises in some of these places that you might think were pretty out of reach for opposition parties, and that's why there really is a similarity with the Red Wall in that sense. Is that these things could happen slowly and then actually quite suddenly once you see as you say, a big sort of just feeling that it's time for a change of government. That's the sort of secret ingredient. So both increased tactical voting. That's certainly potentially part of the picture for opposition parties. But I think we can't lose sight of the fact that it's really an anti-conservative swing, or a swing from away from the Conservative Party that will be the main ingredient for the Liberal Democrats and for other opposition parties.
And I think the Jeremy Corbyn and the absence of Jeremy Corbyn next time round is a really big factor in that respect. That one of the things that really propped up the Conservative vote in 2019 was Tory voters who were amenable to being persuaded to vote Lib Dem.
Yeah.
But when it came to the crunch, thinking there's no way I want to stomach the idea that Jeremy Corbyn might become Prime Minister, and therefore the best way to ensure he doesn't become Prime Minister is to re-elect the Conservative MP in my constituency. That was, I think, a very powerful argument for a lot of people. And I think the absence of that and how much of an impact it will have, we probably won't know until the actual election results are in, because a lot of those last minute, those decisions are made relatively late in the campaign. But it certainly looks like Keir Starmer is in that sense in a completely different league from Jeremy Corbyn, isn't he? That there is that, you don't vote Lib Dem because you might let Keir Starmer in. Just feels like it's going to be a much, much weaker argument than the don't vote Lib Dem because you might let Jeremy Corbyn in.
Yeah, and that's where it's difficult to really know when we see these opinion polls how seriously to take the vote share that is shared amongst the Labour Party, the Green Party, and the Liberal Democrats, because actually you could see it as, broadly quite positive news, just an increase in the block of voters that say they won't vote for the Conservative Party and might say now they will vote for the Labour Party. That and the rise in support we've seen recently in the Green Party. I mean, on one level, you could say that that's those voters aren't necessarily saying moving to the Liberal Democrats. That you're hovering in and around sort of 10% in the polls still, but it creates an increasing pool of voters who will countenance voting in a tactical way against the Conservative Party, and that creates a wider pool of voters that you can target in the constituencies that you're most likely to win. I mean, this is I think an underappreciated aspect of the opinion polling at the moment. Is actually maybe it makes more sense not to try and think about the headline vote numbers, but broadly looking most closely at the vote share of the Conservative Party, and the lower that falls, the more opportunities there are for the other parties to prosper.
Spookily, just before you were saying that, I was just reaching for my table of the latest opinion polls from each pollster, because I was thinking exactly the same point. And at the time of recording, if you look at the 9 main pollsters, mainstream pollsters who have had voting intention polls published in the last few weeks in the UK, 7 of the 9 put the Tories on under 40%, and the other 2 put them on 40%. And that, that only has to fall another couple of points to be in the territory where you think that's a real struggle for the Conservatives to get a majority based on that. And I think that's different from what we've seen in the past in some periods where the Tories have, their headline lead may have fallen, but you still then say, well, actually, look, the underlying vote share is still one that should, will almost certainly get them re-elected. This is looking much more brittle, isn't it?
Yeah, and pollsters find it harder to deal with smaller parties. They can't account fully or really for tactical voting. So I suppose what I was saying to Liberal Democrats, actually, that potentially the most important figure for you is whether that Conservative vote share continues to fall. That's actually probably the best and cleanest barometer and easiest barometer to judge and measure the likelihood of the Conservatives getting getting into some serious trouble pretty soon.
Yeah, and I think that highlights as well this issue that there are many things that can be said around progressive alliance type debates. But I think one thing in particular that's relevant to what we're discussing is how important, the Conservative Lib Dem swing voters or the Conservative Labour swing voters, depending which seats you're thinking about, are. And that one of the risks with people getting too fixated on progressive alliance type conversations is that you end up using them almost as an alternative, as a sort of perceived soft option, because, it's easier to talk about, isn't it awful that Party X is standing a candidate, as opposed to the hard graft of actually thinking about how to persuade Conservatives to vote for you. And I think I think that's a particular problem in the Labour Party, because there's such a strong strain of Labour Party culture that essentially disdains the idea that there might be Conservatives that you share some values with and might wish to, win them over to voting Labour. I think in the Lib Dems, there's much more of a willingness to embrace the idea of worrying about how to win over Tories. But even in the Lib Dems, for example, one of the most popular media outlets for Lib Dem Tory swing voters is the Daily Mail. You'd have to hunt very hard to find a Lib Dem activist who reads the Daily Mail. And so I think even in my own party, we should be mindful of that gap. But it does seem to me those swing voters are, you can't ignore them. This isn't just about tactical voting, is it?
No. I mean, the question is actually whether or not, it's actually more beneficial to have separate parties to attract particular voters in particular areas. Again, thinking about the flip side of the structural advantage the Conservatives have in being one party is the ability for opposition parties to be able to target places that, with particular parties that are where they're most likely to be successful. For example, as you say, in North Shropshire, the underlying data and the trends for the political parties show that the Liberal Democrats are probably structurally better placed in the Labour Party, whereas in elsewhere, in Old Bexley and Sidcup, it's the Labour Party, and the ability of parties to target the places where they're most likely to be successful is something that the Conservative Party can't do. I think maybe that's an underappreciated. That would be an underappreciated loss for people that if there was any sort of progressive alliance, if you like.
Yeah, and there's a very classical analogy with the commercial world in that sense, isn't there? It's very normal for companies to have different product lines or different brands that are aimed at different points in the market. And although, the analogy doesn't work perfectly for politics, I think it does seem to me there are definitely some voters that the Lib Dems can reach that Labour would really struggle to reach. And actually, conversely, if you look at some of the very heavily Leave voting areas of the country, there are some where the Lib Dems have had huge success at council election level. Sunderland would be a really good example. But I think there are others where it's definitely a much tougher job to persuade an unhappy Tory to vote Lib Dem than it might be for a Labour person to try to persuade them to vote Labour. And I think, it's sensible to reflect that in different parties' approaches, that, different parties have got different strengths in different places. But I for the Lib Dems, obviously this blue wall area is particularly important for the next Westminster election. But I know you and Tim and others have sort of previously used the phrase yellow halo, which didn't quite catch on in the way that blue wall has. I just wondered, when you did start looking at this yellow halo idea long before the blue wall phrase was coined, is it really just different terminology for roughly the same bit of the country and the same idea, or are there some real differences between how you've sort of thought about the yellow halo and how people like me now talk about the blue wall?
Oh no, yeah, I've had a bit of a joke with this about James. Yeah, they're basically the same. They're basically the same content. I suppose that I prefer the blue halo in a sense, because it does give a tighter geographical definition, in that we're talking about a range of seats that stretch from Oxfordshire and Cambridgeshire to west of London and just around London, where not just the demographics but also the shifting demographics over time are more likely to be beneficial to the Liberal Democrats. And the places that we highlighted in that report were places where actually also where, it's fair to say it's been a sort of a tough decade for the Liberal Democrats in and out of government electorally after being in and out of government. But we're actually, in many of these places, you're in a better position than you were back in 2010. So it's also looking a bit at the history of these places to show that there are, and these are places of relative strength in the last decade. I think that's important when thinking about some of the sort of organizational elements of targeting these places. And also, I think trying to get a tighter geographical grip on where the Liberal Democrats might do well is important, because I think it was I can't remember the name. Rallings and Thrasher and Danny Dorling back in the 90s, they came up with this idea of the epidemiology of the Lib Dem vote. This was long before epidemiology became a part of,
before we all became expert epidemiologists. Yeah,
this idea that there is that voting Lib Dem can catch on, and can go from ward to ward and from constituency to constituency is really important, and that's why the geographical concentration of the places where there's a high number of graduates and so on, and where there's a potential Lib Dem core vote is really important, and that contrasts with the places that where Labour are best placed, because there are some places that are very like, Hitchin and Harpenden or what's Dominic Raab's constituency again? There are places that are really like Hitchin and Harpenden and Esher and Walton where Labour are best placed, but these places are spread right across the UK in a more disparate way. So there are a couple of Lib Dem places in the north that you can target, places like Cheadle, but there aren't as many. So it makes it that's the distinction between these high graduate, high Remain areas for the Liberal Democrats and for Keir Starmer's Labour Party.
And I think the other key thing for the Lib Dems in all of that is that if there is a hung parliament, the more disparate your support is, the harder it is to do anything in a hung parliament that doesn't shatter your support base. And the point I always make about the 2010 to 15 parliament is, for all the post-mortem that can rightly be done about what was done during that parliament, the fundamental Lib Dem problem was the people who voted for us in 2010 were just so disparate. There was a huge chunk who didn't want the Tories, a huge chunk who didn't want Labour, and a huge chunk who were basically anti-politics. And if you've got only a relatively small chunk who are positively pro-Lib Dem, and so whatever we did in that parliament, it might have ended in a disaster rather than in a catastrophe, but it's really hard to see how it could have ended well because of the disparate nature of that support. I think, the potential advantage of the sort of blue wall way in which Westminster politics is playing out for the Lib Dems is you can see a route to having more MPs, a hung parliament, and enough homogeneity in that Lib Dem support to then, obviously it will still be possible to screw up, but for there to be a plausible route as well, though, that wouldn't involve automatically shattering your support.
Yeah, I think that's become even more important given that political geography has become part of the sort of currency of debate for political commentators and stuff, with the things like the red wall, and with the fracturing of British politics more generally. The ability of people to say, you've sold out X place and Y place, that's potentially a bigger sort of an even bigger problem than potentially it was 2010, 2015, because it's become part of the way that people in Westminster, talk about British politics. I think that's potentially, as you say, a really important factor when thinking about how, Lib Dems could enter government again.
Yeah, no, that is really fascinating to get your insight on all of those things. Just before we wrap up, I guess thinking about all of that in a non-partisan way, of course, given your role, although you are wearing a Lib Dem top. If you were to give one piece of advice to the Lib Dems based on your research, and I'll obviously include a link to the pamphlet in the show notes so people can read it and digest the fascinating graphs themselves. But if you were to give my party one piece of advice, what would it be?
I think it's difficult to give Lib Dems advice on electioneering because you guys are the masters at it. But I think a clarity of purpose and a clarity of message, and understanding that you need both of those key ingredients. You need to see a movement away from the Conservative Party nationally, as well as a targeting of places that where progressive voters are most aligned. That's the route to getting those 25 to 30 seats to get back into the game in a big way. But I think these are all things that will have people in Lib Dem HQ nodding along and they probably know already. But I think that's the key sort of takeaway, if you like, from this. It can be done without, the sort of progressive alliances that are often talked about. And voters are quite hospitable to a message of tactical voting. It would be the other thing that I would point out from the literature. I mean, quite a lot of people, I think, over 50%, 60% of voters know which party is best placed in their constituency, which party is in second place. So there are real prospects for increasing tactical voting, given the current state of play in British politics, to capitalise potentially on that anti-government sentiment for the Lib Dems.
Yeah. Thank you, Alan. Absolutely fascinating. I'll also include in the show notes a link to some research from others that I highlighted recently about looking at how much knowledge people have of the tactical situation in their constituency, because I think the main lesson to draw from both that research and what you've just said, Alan, is that there's going to be a lot more Lib Dem bar charts in future, which is always a good note on which to wrap up a conversation. So thank you so much for your time, Alan. Listeners can find Alan on Twitter at DRALANWAGER. That's Dr. Alan Wager. Myself at Mark Pack, and this podcast at Bar Chart Podcast. And do look out in the show notes for the link to the pamphlet that Alan and colleagues authored, and also the couple of other things I've mentioned during the show. And if you like listening, please do tell others about this podcast. Maybe suggest they listen to it while they're out delivering some leaflets with bar charts on it, and do give it a rating or a review in your favourite podcast app. Thank you, everyone, for listening.